What's the difference between courage and vulnerability? I posted that question this week on my Facebook page. Every week I try to post a question that's going to have something to do with the show I want to do, and I posted that question, and I got I think about 118 answers. So I'm going to give you a few of the answers that I just pulled up. Jeff Klubik was the first person to answer the question, and he said courage is the willingness to be vulnerable, but vulnerability by itself can exist without courage. So that was pretty interesting. So vulnerability by itself can exist without courage. And that's an interesting take. Robert said, courage is the ability to go for things and live life fully as our heart and soul wants us to. That's pretty cool. I like that one a lot. Debbie Height said, courage is being scared to do something and doing it anyway. I think that's a very clear, very simple answer. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. Grace Chappell, she gave the classic answer, was more kind of like I said, more of a classic answer. She said, vulnerability is physical or emotional weakness. And I think that's the way most people look at it. Like I'm vulnerable to harm or I'm vulnerable to emotional weakness. And that's a good answer. That's kind of like the classic way of looking at it. We're trying to look at it a little bit differently, but that certainly is a good answer. Deanna Williams said, it takes courage to be vulnerable. And Jeff Brody, a good friend of mine from the East Coast, said, courage is the power of one's will. Vulnerability is the power of one's heart exposed. I have to think about that one because maybe a little deeper than my brain can, can fathom. So I'm going to think about that one, Jeff. In some ways, I posted the question. It's kind of like a trick question because so many believe that courage and vulnerability are impossible to separate. They just coexist. They need each other. Vulnerability has so many different meanings. And for me, it's being up against fear. So when I think about vulnerability, I think being up against fear. I think about taking chances, being exposed, potentially being ridiculed. I do the show every Tuesday and I can get ridiculed. Matter of fact, somebody on the feed said something was and I was trying to get clarity. And then what he said was he was challenging me. And it was really an interesting, I left it there if you guys want to go back and look at it. But, in the past, I would have looked at that like fighting words. And I just said, I'm talking about vulnerability and courage. So I'm just going to leave what he said, the comments there. And, it's your subject when you're vulnerable, when you're exposing yourself, you're subject to, getting shot down. Right. I think that vulnerability, you have a decision about it. You have a decision, and the decision I think you have is am I willing? Am I willing to be vulnerable? I think it's an action. I think vulnerability is an action that you take, and it requires willingness. And I believe it does require courage. Courage is a whole other topic. Often we talk about courage, and we don't have courage without fear. So many times I'm talking to people about their fears, and we distinguish courage as the place to get to be able to work through your fears, and the place that you notice that you're being courageous and in spite of your fears. There's just a lot of different ways to do it. And one of the ways I talk about courage is, are you living a heroic life? Are you living a heroic life of courage, fulfilling your personal potential? I think that's a good way to look at it. My buddy Armando says, are you living life on your own terms? I like that way of looking at it. And the curiosity theory, we approach courage, and that wasn't me, courage and vulnerability as virtues, as superpowers. And in everyday life, we don't necessarily have to call upon courage or call upon vulnerability. But for those of us that want more out of life, for those of us willing to choose a life of challenge, being up against conflict, being up against resistance, courage and vulnerability are very, very much needed. So when you think about that, how do you employ courage and vulnerability in real time when something's happening and you have to be courageous because that's where you want to get to a place? How do you do that in real time? And how do you call upon courage when fear has got you in its grip, when you are just completely surrounded with fear and it's just got you? How do you call upon courage when in those moments? And how do you be vulnerable when you are experiencing yourself being attacked, like someone's talking to you or maybe saying something to you and you feel like you're being attacked? How do you call upon vulnerability? So, the short answer I would say is stay curious. But the path from conflict to resolution and that path to vulnerability and courage isn't always that easy. So tonight we're going to talk about it. So please join me and three amazing guests: a good friend of mine, Brenda Edelman, Stephen Winter, and Lindsay Stephen Berman, and we're going to take a deep dive into courage. Hey guys, how you doing?
Hey,
doing good.
Hi.
So I know you guys all have stories of courage, and how about we do this? Take a second and introduce yourself. How do we start with Brenda first, then we go Stephen, and then we go Lindsay, and maybe just introduce yourself, and then we'll go back, and then maybe you have a story about courage, and we'll go from there. Is that cool?
Yeah. Well, I'm Brenda Edelman. I see I should have put after my name forgiveness coach specifically for this, and storytelling expert. What else would you like me to say?
I think that's good, and then we'll come back because you got a story that I think everybody's going to be able to work off of. Okay. Stephen.
My name is Stephen Winter, and I'm a longtime real estate broker that used the knowledge that I have in about 27 years of real estate to work to understand human behavior and how we function. So I wrote a book and a process called the Communication Code, which just deals with how we actually work together, figure things out together, go through conflict together. So this will be a really interesting conversation.
Awesome. Brenda, if you want to jump out and then come back in, as you come back in, you can type in that. Then while Lindsay's talking, if you want to do that.
Oh, sure. If I can figure that out.
You jump out and pull yourself out. Lindsay, so tell us a little bit about you.
I'm Lindsay Berman. I'm a men's coach and an author. I work specifically with men, and one of the reasons why I wanted to be on here was I believe that there's a very big myth that needs to be busted around men and vulnerability. And I'm sure we will tackle that throughout the course of this conversation.
And so talk a little more about that. It's like, what's that myth you're talking about? What do you think?
Well, the myth for me is that I think that there's a lot of conditioning for men all over the world in different cultures and different religions. And I think there's a lot of conditioning, and there's a lot of might have lost words. My point is basically that there's a lot of men who I think have been raised, grow a pair, be a man, man up, men don't cry. And I think that that's a bunch of BS. I often say to people, if men weren't supposed to cry, then God wouldn't give us tears. but further to that, I belong to about 4 different men's groups, and I've probably logged about 100 hours in the last couple of months just communicating and doing some research. And there are a lot of hurt men who are afraid to open up, who are afraid to share because they feel they're going to be ostracized or criticized or not deemed being a man. And so one of my goals as a men's coach is to try and educate and work and support these men and have them recognize, in my personal opinion, you're actually more of a man when you allow yourself to be vulnerable. And as you intimated earlier, Martin, that, for me, it's all about being transparent and being genuine. And yeah, you're possibly setting yourself up to be hurt, but that's part of the process. Like if you're going to allow yourself to be vulnerable, you have to know there's a chance you might get hurt.
So part of making the choice of being vulnerable is saying, hey, listen, I could probably get hurt here.
I think so. 100%. Yeah.
What do you think about that, Stephen or Brenda?
I'd love to chime in because and you've joined in the morning. So every single morning I do a coaching group, and every single morning in that coaching group, I started off by reading something from Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and then I talk about some of the issues that I'm going through. And I've created a very vulnerable space in there because I'm not afraid to talk about the things that we think we shouldn't be talking about. in the work world, we work our tails off. I'm not saying in all instances, but in my household, I'm the provider, and there's a lot of responsibilities that I take on being the provider, and I think that I have to always produce. And in always having to produce, I forget to enjoy the journey. I'm always focused on the destination. And then I have this inner conflict of slowing down, being present. And I talk about these things, and it's unbelievable. I usually have between 7 and 11 people on this call. And what's been amazing is there's a lot of men on the call, but one of the things that they've really been grateful for is that they can speak openly about what they're experiencing and going through, because there aren't that many places where you can just go and be vulnerable and be accepted in your vulnerability, as opposed to ridiculed, put down, mimicked, which is what causes so many of us to just start to clam up again and think that we have to man up again, which unfortunately I think to what you're talking about, Lindsay, is what a lot of the people that you're probably coaching go through. And I just wanted to make one more comment before we go onto Brenda's interpretation of this. But one of the things that I had to figure out for myself was nobody else can hurt me but me. So when I open myself up and I tell my truths, and they're pretty heavy, like I don't really hold back on my truths. I tell my truths, but I'm not worried about what the outside world has to say back to me in a way that if it were negative, it's not going to affect me, because I also understand that the response I'm getting from somebody else is their opinion, which has been layered over years and years of life, of their experiences, and that's okay. And they're coming from a place that I don't quite understand, but I've worked to understand myself. And so it's not that I put up a Teflon wall. It's just that I'm not looking at the meaning that's coming to me and going, oh yeah, you must be right. I'm that. So it's interesting to create the safe space for people. And I love it. It's done wonders.
I've been on your calls many a times, and yeah, it's a very, very safe place. And it's really great how people are sharing really what it's like for them, how they're afraid, how they're up against what they're up against. Maybe it's just like simple things, but that's kind of what human beings are up against. Often just real simple things. Brenda.
Just one more comment, sorry, Martin, with what you're saying. One guy who's around 60 was still remembering that his dad called him a sissy, and he's still carrying that at 60.
Yeah.
It's amazing for me to be like a fly on the wall in this conversation, because I feel so in a way sheltered, because I have so many men in my life who actually don't go by that. Like, I got to man up and things like that. Some of it goes back to, 20 years of studying in spiritual psychology. And so the people I associate with are men who, who realize that they can be vulnerable and that there's strength in that vulnerability. So in a way, it completely breaks my heart that this is still so toxic. It's the other side of, you're acting like a girl, which is putting women down, is like, man up. It's really great that you're talking about this. And of course, vulnerability to me is the key to really being seen, being willing to be hurt, but also being strong enough in yourself, like you were saying, Stephen, too, that you don't care about what someone else says. It's about you, but also knowing where you can be vulnerable, right? If both, let's say in a partnership, if both people are unconscious, then they're going to play their roles. But we seek out to be with people who are going to see us for who we are and see all of this in that holistic way. The other thing is, I got into this because my father absolutely was one of those men that's like, you cannot show your emotions. You just got to man up. And he shot and killed my mother, So for me, like, I'm on the bandwagon of let's give men an outlet to be able to be themselves. We're all humans. It's really not a gender thing. It's just conditioning. And so, like I said, I'm so surprised that so many men, like, and people who are in my circle, are also facing this fear of expressing their vulnerability and not knowing all the answers. But it's time to really let people know that it's okay. It's okay to be whoever you are. And then teaching your partner, if you, or your business associate, or whoever you're with, that both, you know, it's like both genders can embrace the masculine, the feminine, and take the good parts of both of those things.
You guys all said so much rich stuff. You kind of finished up saying, you know, it's okay to be who you are. And what that makes me think of is like, you got to build something on a foundation. If you have a false foundation of who you are, that is, you know, maybe built on a false belief that you can't express yourself, and like what Lindsay said, you know, you can't, you know, it's taboo to do these things, or you know what Stephen was talking about, you know, like a willingness to, you know, now starting to be willing to be heard. And then you did it, that to me, I think you got to find a foundation, I believe. And then from that point, the foundation, then you can start to build who you want to be.
Yeah.
Like, who do I want to be now that I've broken down these walls, and I'm saying, okay, maybe I can cry. Maybe that's not your thing. It's okay if that's not your thing. I think it's about being in touch with whatever your thing is, but having that be something authentic. Go ahead.
And also, especially if you're someone, and this could be for women too, you know, if you're someone who is finally realizing that you can express yourself and that these feelings are okay, you do have to be careful with who you express them to. Like, I teach storytelling. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to tell my story, even to someone you think is going to be supportive, because they may shut you down because they don't want you to feel those feelings. They think they're helping you. So it's like really knowing, like, it's great you guys have other men to talk to so that you can open up. But it is a whole nother dynamic, men talking to men about it, than bringing women in. So I am glad that you brought me in here today, so that a woman's perspective can be like, you know, a little bit different.
You know, I started doing, you know, like my personal development work at the age of 19. And so for me, kind of my whole adult life has been about expressing to men or women or whoever. So it's kind of, for me, it's kind of like, what, not like I'm making a judgment. It's just, wow, so you don't express yourself, you know? And I just find that, well, I don't express myself because maybe I don't know how to. I don't know the vocabulary of expressing myself. I don't know what words should I use to say that I'm feeling this way or that way. You know, in the curiosity theory, we just start with yum or yuck. Let's just start with yum or yuck, and that's kind of a base place to start. And then you go from there, and you can start adding words to that. And I think that for so many men, that it's just a lack of vocabulary. We don't have the words that really connect to the feelings that we're feeling. So how do we express ourselves if we don't actually have the language for those emotions?
Well, you know, you can go back to, I'm sad, I'm mad.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
One of go ahead.
I wanted to just touch on something that, Stephen, that you shared, and Martin, that you shared. So, Stephen, you were talking about a 60-year-old gentleman who has this memory about being called a sissy. And Martin, you were talking about the foundation and expressing yourself. So I wanted to share something because it's, I think, part of the reasons why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. So my father left when I was 10. And he moved 3,000 miles away. And I guess it was about 2 years ago, I had basically said to him, you know, you're going to be 80 in a couple of years. And I said, we talked a long time ago when your father passed away about all this pain and shame and guilt, all the emotion you haven't dealt with for the last 65 years when your biological father walked out on you.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to explain to him that, you know, nothing's going to change until you start looking at that. And I said, it doesn't matter that you're almost 80. That work has to be done. And I'm a believer that whatever we don't do this time around, I won't go off on a whole tangent, but I believe when we return, we pick up where we left off. And so it's interesting to hear about the 60-year-old, because I'm sure my father, who is now 80, probably has memories of his own biological father and how he was treated. And then going back to your point, Martin, about the foundation expressing, I don't think my father ever got a foundation, hence why he's never learned how to express himself. And I think there's a lot of men that are in that boat, and I feel really bad for them.
Yeah.
Well, there's
is it that they don't have? Is it that he didn't have a foundation, or the foundation that he had didn't include that?
Well, I'm talking about his own personal foundation as a human being on this planet.
So I got that. You know, the one thing I think about my father, and I think about my mother, and then I think about my grandmother. My grandmother says a story is that, we didn't hug and we didn't kiss our kids. And my aunts and my uncles all say, yeah, my grandma never hugged and never kissed me. And she didn't start hugging her kids until me and my brothers came along. And then she was probably like 70 years old by then, 60 something years old. And, it's not what they did. Like, her foundation was different. And I don't even know if the way we're doing things right now is right. Like the way I'm trying to do things, like with my own children or with my friends, and how I'm expressing myself. Like, how do I know that the way I'm doing it is right? I'm just doing it based on the best way I can. And I do believe that my parents did the best that they could do.
Well, can I ask you something though?
Yeah.
What about the element of going within and finding out what is the right thing to do? Like, what is the right thing to do based on that intuitive place? As a woman asking you guys, it's like there's the thing you think we are doing the best we can. But I know for me, and like parenting is hard. I know for me, it's like sometimes we act out.
Yeah.
But we have the opportunity to go within and say, okay, what can I learn from that and make a different choice? Unless someone doesn't have that ability. Because if I think about my father, I could have talked to him until I was blue in the face, and he would have maybe heard it and then dismissed it because of his lack of empathy. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. Well, let me go back to my grandma. So my grandmother was a daughter of a mistress. Like, my great grandmother was a mistress. And that's what my grandmother was. And my great grandfather was a plantation owner.
Oh gosh.
So, like my grandmother version of doing what she did probably was an evolution from where she came from.
Right.
Think about and so my father grew up in Mexico. When he was 12 years old, my great grandfather was assassinated. So he's got all that. And is he doing his best? Yeah, I think he's doing his best. I think he was doing his best. Did I like what he did? No, I didn't like what he did. That's a whole different.
I'm not condoning and saying like, oh, they did the best that they could, because everybody has access to something bigger or better. I mean, you think about people who've lived through things like Oprah, was raped and all this stuff, and yet she didn't have the foundation, and yet there was something within her that was able to tap into something bigger. You know what I'm saying? So it's a mix of nature and nurture, maybe,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, go ahead. What do you think that is, Lindsay? What do you think? What do you think that is, that thing that we have inside ourselves? That, like, I think that Brenda's distinguishing. There's a thing inside of ourselves. We weren't cut breaks. We had the life that we had. It wasn't perfect. We got beat. We got raped. We got left on a doorstep. We got all this stuff. And I'm going to make something better of myself. Like, what is that about us?
And no matter how old you are, you can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And I can speak for myself that, I've got a 12-year-old daughter, and I have tried, and I agree with what you said 100%, Brenna, and you as well, Martin. I know that my mom and my dad did their best with what they knew at the time before my dad left, trying to raise me and my siblings. I've spent 20 years doing personal development, and I continue to do it. And a big piece of that was working through a lot of my anger and resentment toward my dad for leaving, because when he initially said he was leaving, I thought, well, he'll go and have an affair. He's actually not going to leave my mom and 4 kids. Of course he's going to come back. And I really believe that. So I think that there's a piece around, at some point, I made a decision. I don't want to end up like my dad. And so I immersed myself in my own personal development work, and doing a psychotherapy training, and I had this big piece of work around shame to do. And the facilitator said to me, "Do you want to go?" And I said, "No." I said, "Because I think everyone in this room is going to judge me." He said, "Well, you can't let that get in your way. You'll never grow if you're always worried about how people are going to judge you." I looked at the 15 people in my class. I said, "You know what? Screw you all. Let's do the work." So it's just kind of similar with
you all. Let's do the work.
Yeah, and it's kind of similar to what Stephen was sharing earlier around, I think for me, like, part of being vulnerable is that I'm comfortable with myself and grounded. And so you're okay to be vulnerable and not worry about what other people may or may not say. And I think that's a big piece. I think it's hard for anybody to be vulnerable if you're not already in touch with yourself and have your own foundation, comfortable expressing yourself, good about yourself. And maybe that's one of the reasons why my dad's in the position that he's in, because he still hasn't dealt with anything.
One of the things that I wanted to bring up that I think about a lot is also identity. And I mean, who are we when we're growing up? For most of us, we don't really have an identity. We mimic what's around us, our parents, our relatives, our friends, cousins, what we see on TV, and we start to build a platform for ourselves. And then as you start to grow up, for me, it's really, it's uncanny when I look at some of the patterns that my dad lived through, and that I'm like, I'm never going to do that. And then I'm like, I'm doing those things. And it's fascinating to think about breaking the mold. And I think that, that's where the foundation starts to form for yourself, when you have the courage to start breaking the mold of what's known and what's familiar. And the scary part, the vulnerability in all of that is when you start to find out who you are and who you want to be more of and what else you want to explore about yourself and life. And then that's when it can become scary, because the people that know you all of a sudden go, "That's not like you. What are you doing?
Yeah.
Who are you? Why are you saying that?"
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And
people don't like change.
I'm sorry?
People don't like change.
People don't like change, right? But it's fascinating when, and I don't know if all of you can share this, like in what I'm about to say, but I definitely went through this, and I think it was Napoleon Hill who said, "You are, the sum of the 5 people you hang around with." But all of a sudden, as you start to evolve, then the people that you were keeping in your life aren't people that you want in your life anymore, because they were helping you fulfill a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And as you start to delayer yourself and figure out more of, like, I want to be more like this, and to your point, Brenda, as you start to look internally and you start to go, I want to be this, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sorry, my Mac is connected to my phone and it dings every once in a while, but and there we go again.
They want you,
right? But it's one of those.
French fries are up.
Sorry, I am hungry. But it's interesting to break those things down and then to rebuild yourself back up, and then plant the foundation around who you want to be more of, and being okay with that. That's what I mean. Like when I said I'm not afraid of being judged, that wasn't always the case. I didn't understand who I was as I was evolving. And then eventually I started to create patterns for myself that felt right. And it doesn't always mean that I'm right, but I started to go more in a direction that I felt comfortable with. And I look back at the way I patterned myself after my father. And sometimes I still fall into those default modes, but I would talk to my dad about how he was, and he was post-recession era. His mom died when he was young. His dad was poor. He always was basing himself from a scarcity mindset, but I didn't understand those things. I didn't know. And so I just thought, oh, my dad goes out and makes money and I never really see him that much. And if I want to spend time with him, I have to go to work. So, you know, I would beat the shit out of myself working long hours to think that that's what a man was, you know. But he did cry. My dad did cry. And my family is a bunch of huggers, and my mom's from Morocco, and, you know, you kiss on the cheeks and stuff like that. So I never had a problem with the sensitivity side that you might see, Lindsay. But I wanted to share all that because this has been triggering a lot of stuff in me, thinking about how am I who I am today and where did I start, and the journey wasn't easy. The journey wasn't easy.
I want to build on that, but I want to acknowledge some of the people and some of the comments. Like Robert Ritter says, many men hide behind their masculinity. That's something I think that we hear a lot. Jeff Klubik said, if you never tell a lie, then you never had to play dumb. That's interesting. Andy, that's from the guy from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, right? Kristen Miracle, how you doing? And Jessica said it's overcoming the negativity bias. I'm sure she was talking about something that we were talking about. And Horace Chavez said we were made to survive, so our survival mechanism kicks in and push us through adversity. I think everybody would agree to that. Some really great points. Keep chiming in, guys.
I wanted to say one thing about Stephen was talking about judgment, right? That you don't judge yourself anymore. I think that was what you were saying.
It's not. I'm not as hard on myself anymore. Or when people make comments, you know, to me that make me go, "Oh my God, I might be that." You're right, and then crumble.
Yeah, you know, I think what happened for me, because I share my personal story on stages all over the world. I've presented my story for over 12,000 people. And you would think a story like mine, you know, my father shooting and killing my mother and then marrying my aunt, would not have any judgment, me sharing it. But, you know, my work's about forgiveness. And so I forgive my father, but I also forgive my mother. And there are some people like, why should you forgive any of them? But I think what happened for me, maybe 10 years ago, after I had already started sharing it, is that I didn't, instead of like being scared of judgment, I assumed there would be judgment.
Interesting.
I didn't, you know, because I think sometimes people don't get started and they're unwilling to be vulnerable because they're afraid of judgment. But if you actually understand it's part of how the human psyche works, and I made a choice that I would rather be courageous and feel vulnerable and tell my story and be a bigger person, make more of an impact in the world, than be small, because we'll be judged for being small and silent too. And I'd rather have more of an impact in the world.
So what did it mean for you to be courageous? When you said, I'd rather be, so you're making a choice, I'd rather be this thing. What is that thing? What is that? How do you define being courageous in that
being
context?
Courageous was some of the things that you said, doing what you are so afraid to do, but yet that there's that voice inside you that's like, I have to do it anyway, no matter what it is. If it's to tell your story, if it's to leave a relationship, if it's to start a business, it's that thing that you're really scared to do, but you're coming from this place inside, like, you know, you have to do it. And being vulnerable is putting yourself out there and knowing that you could get judged, knowing that you might not, for me as an actor, presenter, knowing that you might not get the best review, that you have to start as a beginner sometimes. That's being vulnerable. But you, in order to be a master at anything, you have to be vulnerable and start in, you know, one place.
I think the contrast of it is what's really, really important, because if you're going to be vulnerable, it means that you're going to be something, like you're going towards something. So there's got to be a contrast to look and say, well, I've evolved from that. I've grown from that thing. Or if you feel like maybe you're not being courageous, that's the place to start for. That then becomes the contrast. And it's like, wow, I'm now being courageous. I'm like, because that's a different action than I was doing.
Yeah.
And like Lindsay was talking about, it worked with men that don't express themselves. It's like, okay, well, there's the place that you weren't doing, is not expressing yourself. So what do you celebrate? You celebrate the vulnerability, you celebrate the courageousness. And you look at the contrast, like, wow, I was there, and now that's like me.
And both courage and vulnerability can have you grow. But again, I want to say firmly, to be vulnerable around the wrong people or who people are going to stop you, that's not smart. So it's like, because I have this pet peeve right now with all this marketing. It's like, be vulnerable, be vulnerable. And I work with people who have really big stories, and then they feel exposed and they feel hurt and they want to run away. So it's not like be vulnerable just to be vulnerable as like a marketing thing. Like, be vulnerable so that your relationships can be more connected. Be vulnerable so that you can really make a difference, because when you're vulnerable, your heart is open. So you're touching someone's heart too.
That's exactly what Mark is saying. Mark Harbaugh, who I met through you, Brenda. He said, great conversation. He said, I deal with this as a professional who people come to as a trusted advisor and as a gay man. And they feel the pressure to be strong. The practice for me is to be courageous. The practice for me is to be courageous, to be vulnerable where appropriate and where I feel comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering like how, like you're saying where I feel comfortable. And I just want to challenge you that you're actually, Mark, you're actually doing it where you don't feel comfortable. Because where you feel comfortable, you don't need to be courageous. You don't need to be vulnerable because it's life, it's regular life.
I wanted to ask Brenda a question. When you were saying about some of the people that you're working with being vulnerable to the wrong audience, my question is, are those people still extremely wounded? Because to be vulnerable and be accepting of yourself, does it matter who the audience is?
I disagree.
Yeah,
that's what I'd like to know.
I disagree.
I don't understand the question. So
the question is she saying be careful who you're vulnerable with, because those people can take advantage of your vulnerability and maybe manipulate that. I don't know. But I'm asking, if you're
as a concern,
if the person that's expressing themselves in a vulnerable way is still very wounded and isn't accepting of what they're sharing, where if somebody goes, oh, how could you, that's terrible, you are this and this, my point is if you're strong within but you're sharing in a vulnerable way, does it matter who you're sharing to if whatever the reaction is from that person
so
affect you?
Okay.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Thanks for clarifying. I just wanted to understand the question.
Right. So I teach crafting and sharing your story at the same time as healing your story. So yes, in that if you're wounded and you're sharing, so my pet peeve is with like these guru people, coaches, whatever, well-meaning maybe, that are like, be vulnerable, tell your vulnerable story. But if someone is wounded and they haven't healed it, then they're like blurting out this stuff. And then even if they touch people, then they go home and they feel more wounded. I know this because I did 8 years ago when I first started sharing. And the other thing is, the interesting thing is, like, you could be sharing something that you think you've gotten over it or you're gotten through it, and it's multi-layered. When I'm talking about like big stories that you're being vulnerable with, and then someone says something, and it's like another deep level of healing it. So as far as being vulnerable, yes, I bet you I could share things. Here's an example. I won't say who it was, but years ago, someone introduced me to someone who's like a leader of an organization, and they said, oh, her father killed her mother. And I'd already been presenting my story, doing so much inner work. And he's like, oh, I guess that's one way to get divorced. He said it flippant. Get out of a marriage. He said it flippant. This is a leader of a spiritual community. And I'd done my work, so I didn't have to say anything back to him. I decided never to ever join that community because I thought it was completely inappropriate for someone I didn't know, but I didn't get wounded. But if I hadn't done the level of work, that would have been devastating to me. So sometimes it's the people you don't expect that come out and say something. Like, it's almost easier to know not to share with, your mother-in-law who says that kind of stuff, but someone else who you think is going to be for you.
Yeah, I think, let me kind of respond to what you said, Stephen. I think a lot of times that you find people that are learning how to share and they're still working through their process. Yeah. I remember, I don't remember where it was, but I remember somebody had said to me, or said to the group, if what you're doing, if you're not like, if you're sharing a story and you're not comfortable about that story and you're not healed about that story might not come out really the way you want it to come out when you're sharing it with people, because you still have a charge on it. So as leaders, like Brenda's saying, is like, as leaders, I think we have to do the work so that we can then get that story, because it is the story that I'm telling you because I need you to hear it from me so I can heal, or am I going to be able to tell the story so that it may be able to impact you?
And I'm not saying you have to be completely healed before
No, not at all.
Vulnerable, but it's like, make sure you have that arsenal, that those tools, that in case you do get triggered, you stay strong.
Yeah. And then Stephen had said something, or I think Stephen said, like, you don't care. And then you clarified that. Like, it's not that you don't care. And what I wrote about that, it's that you stop letting caring stop you.
Yeah.
Caring doesn't stop you as much.
All I know is we all have experiences, right? Everybody has experiences that we recall, and they're all different, and they all scarred us in certain ways. And I've just come to understand that everybody has something, and some people have many, many, many somethings, and some people have stories that are like, oh my God. And it's just a matter of, are you wanting to live, and do you want to experience life, and do you want to work through those things? And if so, I mean, there's going to be pain in that release, and there's going to be a lot of things that you have to figure out. But it's like, it's not about the caring to say, oh, I care too much about protecting my heart, like what I would call shielding my heart.
Yeah.
I just understood that if I want to progress, and if I want to create an environment where I have people that are really in a safe space with me, I want to talk about some heavy duty shit, because we're all going to experience it. We've all experienced it. We will continue to experience it. But the more often you understand what the process is like for yourself and you build that foundation, it's okay to hear other people's points of view and be like, okay, that's great. Sure.
Because how do you say that? Well, I didn't take offense to it, or, and then you
a little bit of offense.
And then you, because with the whole thing with your story about your father, like, I forgave him, but yet I still took him to court. That was
really healthy boundaries.
Yeah, that's a really, really powerful distinction. And let's use that for vulnerability, or let's use that for courage.
Ooh, like,
this hurts me, but yet I'm still going to do it. I'm going to.
Yeah.
Like, you said something that was offensive. I'm not mad at you. I'm not offended, and I'm not going to be around that kind of conversation.
I was actually a little offended by that. It just struck me, but I won't waste my time on something that I think is petty with someone I'm never going to be in a communication with. Taking my dad to court for wrongful death. Now that probably took the most courage I've ever had. I would have said getting over my mother's death, but no, that and vulnerability in that, and the most strength. And I did it from a place of self-love because I had forgiven him, but I didn't want it to be out of a place of punishment or just getting justice, good thing, since he didn't act, because he skipped town, even though we won a big judgment. That was probably the most courageous thing I've ever done in my life, and the most vulnerable. And I was terrified. It was a lifelong pattern of just loving my father so much, and being daddy's little girl when I was younger, and then having this my family taken away in one night, and vacillating between I love him, I hate him, I love him, I hate him for like 3 years, and then finally realizing, no, I actually hate what he did. And I have to stand up to my father for the first time, and I love him. And how can I do this from a place of self-honor? And I was terrified, thinking I'm going to face my father. It was a lifelong pattern, right? Look at the roles you play in your family. It was a lifelong pattern. That's my father. I have to respect him. I have to, so I broke a lot of patterns in that. And then not knowing, there's vulnerability is not knowing. I didn't know if he would show up in court. He ended up not showing up in court. I didn't know if my aunt, who he married, would be there, going to court, having, media outside and stuff like that. And so the vulnerable places, I guess, being in the unknowing, right? And that's a big story, but it's that unknowing. If you're in a relationship and you're going to tell them how you feel, or you're going to tell them that you're going to leave, it's a vulnerable place. So
it's a risk. So I want to kind of take that apart, Brenda, because I know you and I have talked about it so many times, and it's an amazing story. So there was the vulnerability. I think what happens, like if I'm kind of dissecting it, you have an awareness of there's a situation, and the situation is there's a requirement to the situation. It either stays this way, or it gets worse, or I have to have some considerations around it.
Make a decision.
And the decisions and the considerations that you're going to have around the choices that you're going to make do require, I say, being curious, and then being vulnerable enough to be curious, because that is like, this is my dad. This is the one I adore, like you're saying. And it's not that I don't love him, which to have that consideration requires vulnerability and courage.
Yeah, it's that whole thing of keeping my heart open instead of wanting to close down. And that's really where I learned how to do that.
What did you learn? Like, what did you do? Like, that's like huge, because we can talk about the thing, but I'm really interested in, like, what did you learn that you did that? Like,
well, I mean, I think what happened for me, because my heart was like shut down to protect myself, is I just had that insight that if I hate my father, I hate myself, because he's a part of me. And when I had that, I thought, well, why would I want to? I realized that any part of me that was closed down, my heart to him, was closed down to me too. And if it was closed down to me, it was also closed down to the people closest to me. And so that was just like a divine insight that I got. And then with knowing that and being able to reflect, I was like, well, what can I do that's going to be self-honoring and filled with self-love? And I actually think that's how I was able to take him to court. I almost couldn't before that because of the old patterns. And I, like I said, so my heart opened, and what it really did, I thought it was forgiving him, but it, like, my heart opening to see him as a full being, like multifaceted, the little child in him, how he grew up, all that like forgiveness flowed back to me, and I was able to love myself more. And in that place of loving myself more, my life changed.
Lindsay, I'd like for you to kind of comment from your perspective from a men's coach. Like, how do you see that? Like, how does that work with you and the men you work with?
Well, I was actually going to just tag on to what Brenda just said in relation to my own father, because, I've shared a little bit about my dad, and, there's, I think there's often intergenerational patterns that happen. Mm-hmm. And I did some work a couple of years ago with a gentleman where it was all around doing the work around my dad, but trying to figure out, why did my dad behave the way that he did? What happened with his relationship with his father? And then we even went back to, I guess it would have been my biological grandfather's father. And so just tagging on to what Brenda was saying, after the work was done, I realized that, my father's not a malicious person, and he's not a bad person. He just didn't know how to be a dad. And I made peace with the fact that my dad didn't know how to be a dad because his biological father wasn't a dad to him. And it sounds like that his biological father wasn't a dad to him either. So the point I'm trying to get at is, I think Brenda made a really good point, is I got to a place where I kind of said to myself, you know what? My dad's my dad. Is he perfect? No, but none of us are. But I wanted to get to a place where I can make peace in my heart and say, you know what? I don't want to hold on to resentment or anger or hurt anymore. I want to deal with it so I can just have a relationship with him. I don't want to be one of those men where, God forbid, I get a call tomorrow saying, your dad passed away last night, and I got all this stuff inside me that I haven't dealt with. And more importantly, that I haven't shared with my own dad. So if, God forbid, a million times my father dies tonight, I know I'd be upset, but it wouldn't be like, oh, I don't have a chance to do A, B, and C, right? Going back to your point about with the men that I work with, it's a big issue. And I'm looking at some of the comments here, and they're fantastic. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right. Is it Horace says no pain, no growth. And that's been the biggest thing that I've been struggling with the men that I'm working with is they're just, it's kind of like they get to a point. Like I always kind of look at coaching as like it's like an onion. You're slowly peeling away onions, peeling away layers of an onion. And what I find is that a lot of the men, when we get to that peel where it's like, okay, now you got to kind of open your heart a little bit and share and be vulnerable, they're not ready for it.
Yeah.
You know, and so I'm working at different strategies to help men to understand. And this is why I said at the beginning about, you know, and it does apply for women too. I know women get vulnerable as well. I guess I was focusing on men because I work with men, but it seems that a lot of men, at least the ones that I've met, kind of think that if I expose myself and I expose how I'm feeling, I'm not a man. And I really think they're like, I think there's momentum. I think we're kind of creating a bit of a paradigm shift, but I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I think you're right. I want to challenge something you said about your father and his father. Because when I listened to the whole context of what you said, to me, it kind of comes around. And when you say, like, he didn't know how to be a dad, but his father didn't do that. So wouldn't it be that he did know how to be a dad? That's how he was to be a dad. Like
no, my father's father.
Let me finish. Like, so he has that way, like his way of being a dad was his way of being a dad. How you wanted him to be a dad might have been different. Like the way I want my father to be a dad was different than he was a dad, but did he do a good job as a dad? He did a great job as a dad. I got some complaints about the way he did things, but he did his version of being a dad. And like Brenda was talking about forgiveness. It's like, well, I'm the one making the judgment. I'm the one that's judging him for his way of being a dad. And I could say, yeah, he did this and he did that. Those are just reasons. But ultimately, it's me taking a look at it and saying, the way you did that, you sucked. Well, that may be the truth, but it's still a judgment. It's still an opinion. It's not true that it sucked. It's just an opinion.
It's what's really interesting listening to you two talk is it made me remember something where for a lot of my life, I was angry with my dad. I was angry because I had an expectation of what I wanted my dad to be. And my dad wasn't there for a lot of my life, because he was working. And my dad doesn't have hobbies. He works. His one hobby was running until he unfortunately, hurt an Achilles tendon. But that's what he did. He would run and he would work. And then he would be out all the time working. And where I come from in Canada, and Lindsay, you sound Canadian with the way you say a boot.
I am.
So I would never know.
I'm like, I need to know where he's from. But
Ontario.
So I'm from Montreal originally, moved to Edmonton. And in Edmonton, it's really north. So summertime, it doesn't get dark till like 11. And when it's like summer solstice, the sun doesn't fully set. So my dad would be out of the house, I don't know, 5, 6 in the morning, meeting people for coffee, and then he wouldn't come home till like 11 at night, till the sun went down. So if I wanted to be with my dad, I had to like go work. And I, I didn't really have a dad that would go throw a football or play hockey with me and play soccer and ride bikes, and I didn't have that. And I held this resentment for so much of my life about how I wanted my dad to be until I finally understood why my dad was who he was. And then it was almost this immediate forgiveness that I was blaming him without him even knowing, right, that I was upset with him because of how he was. And I never understood what shaped his life to the complexity of a scarcity mindset and what it makes you do, and not wanting to be poor like your dad, who was a poor shoemaker, who died early, and his mom died early, and he was self-reliant and he wanted stuff. I didn't understand that. And then once I finally understood it, I was able to like forgive him internally. I didn't have to say, "Hey, Dad, I forgive you now." He didn't even know.
Mm-hmm.
But I forgave the way I was looking at my dad with my expectation. And I think that that's what Martine was, telling you, is like, we want certain things. We believe that there's a model of what we want in our life. But, can anybody ever live up to that model? Like, I'm not always the best husband in my relationship. I don't always understand what my wife wants. I act like my dad sometimes in my relationship.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I catch myself doing those things, and then what she experienced in the way her dad was, if I'm doing things similar to her dad, and her childhood wasn't, spectacular with her dad. So it triggers different things. And I'm like, what, and so it's this amazing work of trying to align yourself with understanding and being open and forgiveness, and not have these expectations or self-interpretations of all these things. And it sounds easier than it is. And, it took me into my late 40s to figure that shit out, about my dad, and forgive and let go. But I have a lot more to do. But to Martine's point, it's just like, we have a story of what we want. And will somebody fulfill that? And if they don't, will that devastate us?
And is it their responsibility to fulfill it?
Sure. Yeah.
Is it my wife? Is it Yvette's job to fulfill the needs that I had? Like, left, getting a divorce, but was it like I can blame her? And I was talking to a friend of mine today, and I was like, the place I'm at right now is I'm trying to figure out how to have a divorce, but not have any blame, like not accuse, not say I have a reason, like to take complete responsibility for getting a divorce, like 100% me, like nothing over there, like you didn't do anything wrong, like it's me, like, and that to me is like, I don't know that I have the courage to do that. I need some blame over there to justify what I've done. Like, that's part of, I'm put together that way. I need her to have done shit, you know what I mean, for me to justify what I've done. Like,
I think a lot of people are like that. To get out of a relationship, it's like, well, they're so bad.
Yeah.
Instead of just the next step is, can we do it despite how painful it feels, to just say this isn't for me? Or
and I like, I'm up against that courage, and I'm up against that vulnerability and that responsibility. Like, I'm up against it. Like, wow.
I wanted to just make a comment about what Stephen was saying, and then your comment about what you wanted to challenge me on. And I guess in my own way, I'm being a little bit literally vulnerable right now. So maybe I misunderstood, but I think what I was getting at was, as a child, I don't think it wasn't done intellectually. I think just when I looked back, I think to a degree, for X amount of time, I did have expectations, but I think those expectations were based on seeing how my friends or my cousins and the relationship they had with their dads.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, when I learned about my dad's childhood, and then as I got older and I realized that, I've got a lot of hurt, I've got a lot of anger and resentment, and I did my work. And somebody, I don't know who it was, but somebody said, no pain, no pain. And someone else was talking about, you have to do the inner work. And I've done that, and I'll continue to do it anytime I need to. I'm not afraid to do that. It was my father that I was trying to encourage to do the same thing, because when my grandfather passed away, I said to my father, you're allowed to cry. You can give yourself permission to cry. You lost your father. Yeah. Oh, I've used up all my tears. I didn't even cry when my brother passed away. Now, the timing might not have been great, and excuse my language, but I turned to my dad and I said, you know what? I said, that's a crock of shit. And I said, to be brutally honest with you, what happened was, I said, you have never dealt with your pain when your biological father walked out on you when you were 14 years old. This is 50 years later.
Yeah.
You looked looked at me and he said, "You're right." So I said, "Dad," I said, "I know you don't believe in therapy. I know you don't believe in psychologists, psychiatrists," I said, "but there's a million ways where you can find a way to work through that." And 17 years later, he hasn't done anything. And I'm convinced he never will.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he won't. I'm sure he won't from how you're describing it. But what does that mean to you? Because, you know, what I learned is that I had to let go of needing anyone I love to do something any differently. Like, what are you making that mean something or?
No. It has no bearing on my life directly. I think it's more just, I'm looking at my dad. I'm saying, like, you're 80 years old. You're still filled with so much anger and pain and shame and guilt and resentment about so much stuff in your life you've never dealt with. But that's his stuff. I mean, he's 80. He's a grown man. So if he's choosing not to deal with it, don't. I think I went to the opposite end of the spectrum because I saw this, 25 years ago when I first started doing my own work, and kind of said to myself, I don't want to end up like him. So I will let myself be vulnerable. I will do the work. And as Stephen has said, and you've all said, it's not a pretty joyride.
Yeah.
It's not pretty at all. And this is what I say to my clients all the time. It's not easy.
Yeah.
I want you to know up front, it's not easy.
Yeah.
But the rewards on the other side are priceless.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and what I want to point out, Lindsay, is everything you've done everything you've said, and all your actions, from my perspective, is expressing and actually, you are epitome of courage and vulnerability. To say to your father, to challenge him, to challenge that person, and to do it. It sounds like you did it incredibly lovingly, which also requires vulnerability and courage. All those things. And then to own it yourself, and to own how you started this conversation. You said, I'm going to be vulnerable. All of that was just showing what courage and vulnerability is. You know what? It's so interesting. It's totally triggering me. So in the way this is I want to be courageous and vulnerable too. It's so triggering me because I'm remembering having a conversation with my father so many years ago before he took my mother's life. I think they were separated at that point, and just spending hours with him. And can't you see? This is what, if you could just see what you're doing. And he kind of seemed like he kind of got it, and he didn't. Yeah. And then I spent so many years trying to reach him. And it was only in realizing that he didn't think like me, that I could never do that I was wasting my life energy on that everything opens up for me. So it's really interesting because it's triggering something for me that I can then go look at and say, okay, so I feel really good that I set the boundaries I did with my dad, and that I realized that my father had a lack of empathy. He couldn't think like I did, if we want to label it as narcissism, or whatever. But this is what I mean by the healing process is I think something in me is still triggered about that. And so I'm fiercely like, I will not spend time on people who, they can't hear me or think like me. And it can be related to today's world. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm trying to look at where am I righteous, and where can I say that's not for me, but from a place of, okay, and my heart is still open, and it's not that righteousness, I want to address this, and I want to acknowledge you, Lindsay. It says, Lindsay, is your work in some way working out those issues with your father? And I want to respond to that before you respond to that. Maybe all of our work is that. like Lindsay has the courage to say it like out loud, right? So that it resonates. And we all have the ability to look at somebody, and this is what the curiosity theory is all about. So we have the ability, we can all easily look at somebody and point at somebody and say, you're doing this, or this is the answer, all those things. We can all give advice from the outside looking, from outside looking in, and the thing is probably most of the advice is dead on. It does. Like, I was talking to my friend Bobby today, and she was saying stuff, we were talking about my marriage. She had questions about it. And so I was saying stuff, and then she was saying stuff to me, and I was like, I didn't really like what she had to say, but I kept listening to it. Like, all right, I'm gonna think about that. And that seems to be like, that's the power. And that's, I think, where courage and vulnerability really show up. Like, this is not what I want to hear. And is courage and vulnerability like, is courage always like, I'm going to go do that out there? Or is courage also, I'm going to do that inside of here? Am I going to appear vulnerable out there? Or am I going to be vulnerable in here? And then let's see where that takes me. And it seems to me like the work that you do, the men's coaching and the stuff that you do, is that kind of work, Lindsay. And it may not appear like so glamorous. You know, it doesn't have a lot of glamour to it, but it certainly has a lot of love and a lot of, I think it's really good work.
I kind of feel like that courage outside and the vulnerability inside, just from what you're saying, is where the match is. It's where real authenticity comes in, because you can be courageous without being vulnerable, like you just shut it down.
Yeah.
Or you can be
fall for the walls, like, right?
You can be vulnerable,
yeah,
but not really courageous.
Yeah.
But when you put it together, like just in what you said there, I was like, when you take a courageous act and it's in alignment with like you're doing the inner work, that's where real authentic communication can come from and really impact, I think.
So it really is all about risking, isn't it?
God damn it.
I wanted to say a couple things. So one, I think what you said, Martin, was actually really important, because for me, you know, the vulnerability starts inside and the courage starts inside. And when I can connect with my own vulnerability and my own courage genuinely and transparently to myself, and I keep thinking Steve's comment about the outside, it doesn't matter what's happening on the outside. And I wanted to, it was Robert, is your work in some way working out those issues with your father? I suppose on some level. I mean, I feel I'm pretty good with my dad now. I think maybe on some subconscious level, I've gone into this work because I see what I've done for myself for the last 20 plus years. And I look at someone like my father, and then I think I've shared this. I can only imagine that there's a lot more men that are in my dad's boat.
Yeah, I think so.
I guess my mission.
A lot of human beings out there.
Yeah, but I guess for me, my mission is like, I want to help as many men as I can. So, you know, when they're 80, God willing, they can say, you know what? I've done my best. I did as much inner work as I can. I feel some genuine peace in my heart and some calmness in my being, and I'm okay. But you got to do the work.
Gift. That's a great gift to give people.
But you have to do the work.
Yeah.
You know, right? I kind of feel like I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
Go ahead.
I kind of feel like the work I do with my one-woman show, it's my way of doing that. It's like I give the people an experience on stage, and even teaching my clients to give the people in the audience an experience. So I'm not one-on-one talking to people, but I also feel like I have an impact with people I never would have an impact with, because they wouldn't be my coaching clients. Because I do remember doing my show one time about 10 years ago, and there was this man, it was at a Jewish center, and there was this man who was like around 80, and he came up to me afterwards, and of course my show is about forgiveness, and at the end, something reminded him of when he was a little kid and there was violence in the family, and he hadn't thought about it for 70 years. And it wasn't from a place of I triggered him into some kind of like place that was going to be bad for him. It was like a wholeness in him came forward because he remembered that story. So there's all different ways that we can touch people by being a living expression of doing this work ourselves, you know?
Yeah, that's really great. I like to try to finish at an hour. We're like an hour and 10 minutes. So let's kind of wind up. Is there anything you guys want to say to kind of close it all out? How about we start? We go backwards. Lindsay, is there anything you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
I'll just say this, that I would invite anybody who's listening or anyone who's going to watch a replay of this to try to wrap your heart around the fact that the only way out is in, and that vulnerability really is a gift, and not to look at it as something taboo or something that's a negative thing. If you want to grow as a human being, you have to become vulnerable.
That's beautiful. Do you work with people online? Is your coaching and your mentorship
online and in person? Except with COVID right now, it's just online.
So, can they get a hold of you like by clicking your name and all that? And
Lindsay Stephen Berman on Facebook and Lindsay Stephen Berman on Instagram.
Wonderful, wonderful. Stephen,
I wanted to just have people be mindful about paying attention to their patterns. And are their patterns theirs, or are we just emulating what we grew up with?
That's a good question, isn't it?
And we're so uncomfortable doing certain things, and we muscle our way through them, right? So that's where the vulnerability in accepting that, hey, I can change, and I'm going to go through the work, which is going to be very painful and very foreign. But pay attention to your patterns. And a lot of us keep defaulting and defaulting and defaulting. And we try, whether that's diet, whether that's exercise, whether that's asking for a promotion, whatever it is. And if you keep finding that you start, snakes and ladders, right? And ask yourself, why am I doing this? And I think that that's going to be a pattern for discovery for a lot of you, is that once you get fed up with repeating these patterns, then eventually you might build up that courage to then be vulnerable and go, I got to try something different. And, I've had to do a lot of that in my life, and I'm continuing to do a lot of that in my life. And I wanted to make one comment about Martine, which he and I work to coach each other twice a week. And it was interesting because you mentioned that one comment that was said to you, and you didn't retaliate or you didn't talk over the person, but that used to be more like you, right?
Mm-hmm.
You wanted to be argumentative and defend your point. So I can even speak of Martine's growth, in that arena, which was huge, because a lot of us don't want to be wrong.
Yeah.
Like, how dare you question me?
I'm one of those people.
Right? But not the same as you used to be. So I wanted to acknowledge you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And your is your morning coaching thing, is that open for people?
Yeah, right now I designed like a 90-day transformational beta program where so much coaching out there. Like, I feel accomplished in residential real estate. I've done it for 27 years, and I teach people how to communicate in order to do business. But before we learn how to do all these actions, those things, that snakes and ladders, those things are going to get in your way. So I work around the mindset, right? Let's tackle what's in your way, and then we can start to learn about what we can do, because now you're going to have a different perspective. Yeah. So the easiest way to reach out to me is I have a coachingwithsteve.com website. So coachingwithsteve.com, email me there. Right now I'm accepting, I have up to 100 spots. We generally have about 12 people, but it's a beta. And these people show up religiously. It's a very vulnerable space. It's not going to cost you anything at this point.
Safe space too.
What's that?
It's a safe space.
A safe space. And it's a platform for me to also express my humanity and my limitations that I want to expand on. And so as a leader, I'm stepping into that vulnerable space and saying, no matter what you see on the outside, or how many deals I've done, or how many transactions, or all that stuff, it doesn't mean it doesn't come with complications up here. And that's what I want to focus on.
Yeah.
I think that's great, Stephen.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Brenda.
Well, I do want to say what I want to leave people with, but there's a great comment here from someone named Michelle Rose. Thank you so much for sharing it. She says, it was a beautiful thing to watch Brenda's vulnerability right before our eyes. It's interesting how my perception of you, Brenda, immediately shifted when you shared that you were being triggered. I see you, and I love what I see. That's just such a good lesson for everyone. I don't know how she saw me before, but that really, thank you so much for sharing that, Michelle, because that also affirms what I do in this world, because I'm an actress and I teach people how to really show versus tell. So thank you. And that was a really vulnerable moment, because I thought I was afraid to say what I had to say. You know, I want to come across as an expert, or like I got it together sometimes, but I know that's not I'm a wounded healer, you know, is what I say. So I think what I want to leave people with is that really it's about self-forgiveness. And along the way, as we're embracing the vulnerability or beating ourselves up for why we didn't say this, didn't do that, didn't take that step, like to remember to just love yourself massively. I always say all those judgments we have are just a way to love ourselves more for all that righteousness. And so that, because that kind of dissolves that energy inside of our bodies, you know. And then a way to, I don't know what that clicking is, a way to, sounds like someone's eating something.
I think it's your microphone, actually.
What?
It's somebody's microphone.
Okay. Well, yeah. And then a way to work with me. Well, first of all, I'm Brenda Edelman on Facebook. I have a Forgiveness and Freedom is my website, but I have a program. It's a 30-day program called Phoenix Rising, a journey into and through forgiveness. Kristen, who was on here, has that program. And it's 1 week of self-forgiveness lessons, 1 week of forgiving your mother, 1 week of forgiving your father, and 1 week of forgiving God, presence, whatever that is. And it's a $200 program that's been pay what you can since COVID came on. So I think it starts at $30. So that's like $1 a day for basically my life's journey and my work. It's 30 different lessons on how to forgive and be free. And
yeah, Brenda's a rock star. Trust me, you want to be coaching with Brenda.
Thank you. I don't have a link here, but yeah, please just reach out to me about that.
That's awesome. You know, when I start a conversation every week, I don't know what people are going to say, and I'm a big believer that people are going to speak their heart from their perspective. And the curiosity theory is all about that. It's all about the ability to listen, the ability to stay curious, and then see what shows up. There's things that, you know, like Lindsay said something, I challenged him. And I don't challenge him like you're wrong, like a challenge, like let's challenge that way of thinking. Let's challenge and see where that can go. And as I challenge other people, I challenge myself. And, you know, the curiosity theories are all about that, about staying curious, being curious and expressing yourself and being able to listen to something. Like Stephen said, you know, I'm able to listen to my friend Bobby when she had something to say to me and not, and maybe I was triggered, but then to be able to be curious inside of that trigger, to be able to like, wow, let me consider that. And as people are making comments, to be able to like be with those comments at the same time. So, you know, for me, what I like to leave people with is the practice of curiosity. And what I say is to stay curious. I want to thank you guys all for coming and hanging out with me today. I really do. I honor both of you, all three of you, actually. I honor all you guys. And what I'm saying both of you is because I want to get Brenda and Michelle, I want to get you guys on I want to do a face, you know, one of these lives with you guys on. I think it'd be some really great energy. So with that, I want to thank you guys and thank everybody that was coming out, you know, hanging out, listening to us. And we'll be here next week. Next week, the topic, we're actually going to talk about lying, about being, you know, how people lie about us, and how lies show up where you have the evidence that it appears that what they're saying about you is true, even though that's a lie. And how do we respond to it? And how do we have lies about other people? How do we make up stuff about other people and then live our life through that? And it's going to be a really, really great class. It's going to be a really great show. So I want to thank you guys for coming and hanging out. Steven, you want to say something?
I want to say good day, to Lindsay. I have to do it.
How about we meet halfway for a back bacon sandwich, Steve?
I'll take it. I'll
see you guys. I love you guys. Thanks for hanging out.
Thank you.
Bye.